How has India secured its place among the BRICS?
It's important to put India into perspective, and the role and relationship that India plays in terms of the BRICS grouping needs to go back to 1991. In 1991, India was virtually a bankrupt economy. It had 2 weeks of foreign exchange reserves, and at that time, the conditions that came out in terms of bailing out India from that bankruptcy was that they needed to open up the market more effectively. And so there was a relaxation in terms of a lot of the legislation that blocked foreign direct investment coming into India. And so in 1991, we had a fundamental change in terms of the Indian economy. And that is what began the transformation of the Indian economy. At that time, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the current Prime Minister of India, was the finance minister. And he spearheaded many of the changes in terms of the Indian political and economic sectors. And that's what resulted, I believe, in terms of the sizable giant that we have as India today.
When India hosted the BRICS Summit last year in 2012, they made the big push for the BRICS Development Bank. Why are they so keen on seeing this bank succeed?
Sure, I think it goes back to the summit that took place in 2012, and what happens, as you rightly know, the host country determines the agenda of the summit. And so this year in 2013, South Africa will be a key determinant in terms of what the agenda of BRICS 2013 is. And when India put together the agenda for BRICS 2012, one of the key factors that was put on the table was this development of a BRICS Development Bank. Why is that important? Well, I think it's as a result of the increase in terms of trade and investment, intra-emerging trade and investment between the BRIC economies, and also between India and Africa, and China and Africa, and even Brazil and Africa. We've seen since 2003 a substantial increase in terms of trade flows from India into Africa. We've also seen a significant increase in terms of the number of Indian companies that are investing, one in South Africa, but then two also in East and West Africa. And so a BRICS Development Bank only makes sense because it provides a countermeasure on behalf of the 5 BRICS countries to be able to create a bank that assists in terms of development finance for key projects, 1 in Africa, 2 in Asia, and 3 in Latin America.
This year, as the host, South Africa is pushing the African agenda. How do you see this developing?
If you trace back to last year and South Africa's accession, in fact December 2011, and South Africa's accession to the BRICS, there was a lot of criticism on the part of the BRIC countries in terms of why they invited South Africa to be part of the BRICS. And what happened then, and I'm quite a firm supporter of this, is that South Africa's role, given the fact that we don't have the size of GDP, that we don't have the sizable population that especially Brazil, China and India have, South Africa's role is really how do we integrate our role in the BRICS to bring in some of the SADC countries. And when you bring SADC into perspective, it's 15 countries, 260 million people, a sizable economy. And I think that's what South Africa is trying to do, is trying to be able to say, how do we play a more proactive role within the BRICS grouping by taking into consideration our role in Africa. And it's not a difficult one because when you put into perspective the size of the Chinese economy or the size of the Brazilian economy, and you compare and contrast that to the size of the African economy, one from a GDP perspective and secondly from a population perspective, it only makes sense to be able to bring Africa into the agenda. But having said that, I think it does complicate matters in terms of BRICS. Africa with 53, 54 different countries, different views, interests, divergent views in terms of how they'd like to address certain issues, and it then becomes difficult. I think where South Africa holds a convenient position is one, the fact that Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma now plays a role in the African Union, and secondly, South Africa being at the table. I've always said that the criticism around South Africa's role and relationship with the BRICS economies needs to stop. It needs to come to a more positive outcome in terms of, yes, we are at the table. What do we contribute to the dinner table? And that's important.
South Africa has a very long relationship historically, politically and economically with India. In the light of BRICS, how do you see these relations panning out?
Sure, I think that's the convenient part, is really looking at the historical, cultural, political relationship between South Africa and India. And it stems a number of years. India was the first country to be able to support the anti-apartheid struggle at the United Nations. India and South Africa share a common citizen in Mahatma Gandhi. Thirdly, we've got a sizable Indian diaspora, myself being one of them, a sizable Indian diaspora from India living here in South Africa. Go to Durban, go to other parts of South Africa, and you see that diaspora making a valuable contribution in South Africa. But what we've started to do, as you rightly say, we're starting to see a significant growth pattern in terms of the economic sphere between India and South Africa. There are now 107 Indian companies of substance doing business here in South Africa, and many of them have become household names. Tata in the automotive sector, in the hospitality sector, in the mining sector even. And then we see sizable investments in the pharmaceutical sector. Companies like Verachia, like Cipla, they've all made sizable investments in South Africa, and they've done it very successfully. And so what's very impressive, and I think what's heartening for me, is that we've seen the first wave of Indian investment being very successful, and that's catapulted what I call a second wave of Indian investment. Beyond the Tatas, beyond the Ranbaxys, is a new wave of Indian companies, especially in the middle tier, the second tier of Indian investment. And that's going to, I believe, fundamentally change the economic trajectory between these two economies, because it's smaller companies, it's medium-sized companies leveraging off the sizable investments from the big companies and really making a big difference in terms of South Africa. And then finally, and I think this is important from a socio-economic perspective, I've identified, and many of us have identified, something called innovation. Indian innovation at the base of the pyramid. And it's really Indian companies that have tailored products to individuals at the base of the pyramid. So recently there was an announcement by the Indian government of a $35 laptop that will be rolled out to 1 million school kids in India. It only makes sense for that innovation to come to South Africa. We speak about an ATM that utilizes solar technology at 1/12 the cost of a normal ATM. It only makes sense for that to be employed by South African banks. And really, if that can take off, we'll start seeing a change in terms of this economic relationship between South Africa and India.